I'm going to talk about some of the hot issues related to Legionella, mitigation, and things that are really keeping the facility folks, owners awake at night, right? NIKA, I have been there for almost 10 years, and we work a lot for the government and a lot of healthcare facilities, so a lot of practical experience on that. Learning objectives, this is a standard AIA format, so pretty self-explanatory. Health concerns, due to Legionellas, being present in the system. The disease itself is called Legionellosis, which is Legionnaire's disease plus Pontiac fever. We'll talk more about that. And also how it's all spread through the water systems and what could be done to mitigate that. And also touching upon some of the regulatory aspects of things, what's going on in the world, how states and governments, not just in US, but all over the world are reacting to this, and what are the things they're doing to make sure that your facility is safe. Just briefly on the Legionella itself, it's a respiratory infection, and it's like pneumonia, and due to bacterial infection, that bacteria is in the water system. So when somebody is exposed to that water, it gets into your lungs, it gets, and starts affecting your body systems, and you get, something called Legionnaire's disease and the Pontiac fever, which is a not, pneumonia form, which is a milder form, but it has been found that that's also existent and has occurred in the past, right? The mitigation aspects of it, right? How do you, design and maintain systems to be able to prevent that from happening? I want to briefly go over this because some of you may have to take calls later on, and you may have to leave or whatever, the last session of the day, primarily. So, facility owners, director, how many of you own facilities and are responsible for their maintenance? A show of hands. And ownership as well. Any of you own the buildings? All right. I just want to talk about some of the aspects why I chose this topic. I grew up at a time when water was kind of not, scarce. It was scarce, but it was not, we had a hard time trying to find the right water to, breathe, and to drink, sorry. And it was an interesting thing. So fast forward, I became an engineer, and I wanted to look into energy and water aspects of the issues. And the diseases are common. We get all kinds of stuff through our environment we live in. So I wanted to take up this task of researching this a little bit, and that's why we are here. Ongoing public health issue, Pontiac fever, Legionnaire's disease, obviously through the aerosols that are created in the water systems. It's not a contagious, it's not like from one person to the next type of thing. The isolation aspects of things are not really required, but something happens and you get exposed to it, then you have to take care of yourself and get treated the right way. What kind of high risk in 50 or older people, 50 years or older, because they have weakened immune systems. It could be dialysis patients or people with lung diseases. So people who smoke on a regular basis, are possible. They could possibly get it if you're exposed to the sort of mist. And this is a diagram just showing some general, body structure, if you will. And by the way, if you have any questions, just feel free to stop me at any time, and we can, go that route either way, or we can wait until the tail end for any questions. So, okay. So historical background. Wanted to touch on this because This problem has been there for a long time, and it's important for us to understand that what are the typical scenarios, typical cases, what kind of building systems, what kind of facilities could be affected because of this. So it was originally discovered in 1976, at a conference in Philadelphia, and it was a cooling tower related. So I think people were hanging around in this area where the cooling systems, cooling towers were located, and they got exposed to this mist, But 1990s, again, it goes to show the amount of things that have been recorded by CDC and really presented, and data is available. 1994, 29 cases in Delaware by itself, and it was a cooling tower related as well. So 1996, again, 11 hospitals in San Antonio. So hospitals are not the best place in the world. They are sort of, you have to maintain infection control, and it's, if you're not able to maintain it right, that could be a problem. Again, in 2000 alone was 1,127 cases. 2001, 800 cases in Spain. So it's pretty much all over the world. We'll talk more about some of the other years on the next slide. The graph on the right, it's a publication that came out of CDC in 2018, and it just goes to show you the intensity of these cases in certain parts of our country. On the far right, in dark blue, and and why is that, right? We'll look into that. What are the temperature conditions that are most favorable for the growth of Legionella? So when in the colder climates, roughly where it's a little colder and not as warm, in transition from spring from winter to spring to warmer weather, there's a big delta that happens in the weather conditions. And so because the conditions for Legionella is close to 68 to 120. So we'll talk more about that. But that's the growth that the CDC reports in those states, and growth in number of cases, obviously. The chart on the right, on the left, sorry, it talks about time frame for last 3 years. What's going on? Close to 621 cases, out of which 29 people died. That's a big deal, right? If I were the owner, I would be worried about even a single person getting infected and possibly dying. It's a big, especially when we have 21 states in these last 3 years, including 12 countries, and we'll look at some cases in detail in the next slide. Any questions so far, folks? A lot of data. So sorry, I had to use some past historical things to be able to explain, why is it important. 2014 and 15, again, this is a graph from a CDC report, and the top one shows, the variation of the cases, the number of cases as a function of weather, as a function of the month of the year. As the weather gets warm, similar to the previous slide, the number of cases go up. And so there's something to do with temperatures, and so we're going to try to understand what's going on. The graph on the bottom talks about the kind of people and settings in which such a thing has happened in the past. Healthcare, incidentally, is a very high, a number of cases close to 649. And senior living centers, close to 68, and so this tells us a story of what's going on. Okay, case studies. So the reason I chose to do this was just to hone in on some of the different types of scenarios that could lead to this. Ohio was, it's a long-term in a 2013, long-term care facility. Close to 39 were infected, and 6 people died. Now, in this case, what had happened was, the cooling tower system had a feed that, chemical feeding system into the condenser water loop. And during periods of, non-use of the tower, so when the temperature goes down, you don't need a tower. The pumping system really didn't pump in as much of, chemicals into the condenser water loop. As a result of which, Legionella started growing in the water. And when it started to pick up, when the load started to pick up, nobody knew, and it got into the system, and people got, mists of those Legionella-laden water, and really caused the issue. So, that's one example of how things could unfold. The second one was the Rome, Italy case, a 2015 study where they had collected samples from 2004 all the way up to 2010, right? And the objective of this research was to see, what is going on, and really, hospitals and research labs can afford this type of study. So they did a tertiary care hospital. 28 out of 97 samples were positive, right? 14 of those were actually a construction period that lasted, in 2008. This was primarily the domestic hot water and cold water system. So they're taking cultures of the water samples from the loops, and they tested them. And because of the fact that, systems were not laid out correctly, and some of the fixtures were not really used all the time, they were able to attribute that to, that sort of the problem. So chlorine levels are also looked into, and again, some of these findings sort of point to what are the things we were going to need to do, during the design and construction phase of projects. New Zealand, this was another interesting, it was actually an industrial site, and there are 5 cooling towers, out of which 2 of them were being added, brand new. And the cooling tower that was not, being replaced, they replaced the cooling tower, but then when they put the new ones in, they were sort of not being used right away, and the water was sitting there, right? So the people who came and worked there, right, the workers got exposed because, again, there's no moving water, and Legionella is growing, the films are growing, biofilms, and as a result of that, they got infected during the working process. So, obviously it was a manual water treatment system, and some of the when they were during the phase that the whole thing was under construction, they were testing the water samples from the cold basin of the tower, right? But when they were taking the water samples from the basin to the lab, they were not putting enough biocides in it. So, and there was a time lag between the time that it was collected in the basin and taken to the lab. So it was a false reading being recorded. They thought that it was all sampled properly, but it was not, and was not treated. So it is one of those classic cases that you don't know if it's going to happen, but when it does, it's a big deal. So 4 patients out of 13 were confirmed to have it, and then 7 were found to have probably the Pontiac fever symptoms. So any questions on this one? I have some the references of these, so if you need anything later on, please feel free to ask me. Going on into some of the classic conditions that Legionella thrives in, biofilms of potable water loop, where the chlorine concentration is not not really being able to bring it down. basically the pools, dialysis systems in healthcare facilities. And so what are the temperatures? So 68 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit is a range that research has shown that they thrive in. Cooling tower water, we have been talking about that. Slow-moving stagnant water in certain piping systems. Sure.
How long does the water have to be stagnant before it's an issue? So like say you turn off like domestic water either in a building or over a weekend, is that cause for alarm or you shouldn't be turning it?
Well, that's a great question. So Legionella is present everywhere, but there has been some research done, but they have not been able to convincingly state that, what is the time period required for it to grow. But it grows very fast, right? So, I can certainly get back to you. We can do some research on that. But, the attempt is to make sure that it's a flowing water and, and the other way is to sort of preventive approach where you are testing the water every 15 days or 30 days or stuff like that. So, but that's a great question. Cooling towers, showers, sinks, bathtubs. This picture here in the middle is actually a cooling tower with a concrete basin. And, it's actually located in San Antonio, Texas. And with the water makeup, you can see that pipe here, discharging water for the makeup. So, hot, humid weather when, if your towers go out of service without a common basin, then you have to be really worried about it. And then this is a decorative fountain. Then, it's easy for the bacteria to sort of, come out through the mist and get inhaled. So talking about the standards, what's going on? So ASHRAE 188 initially was 2015. Now they updated in 2018. Very well put together, very descriptive. They worked in conjunction with the findings of CDC. That's one of the guidelines as well. And it goes into a lot of details of how you should be like designing, and the whole process should be followed. Somewhat like commissioning, where there's a group of people right from the beginning of the the design process, or even in an existing facility, you have to really talk about all of those issues ahead of time. New York State Department, New York became a focus in 2015 when there were a lot of deaths related to cooling tower, water, carrying Legionella, obviously, right? So the state and the city, they mandated, they wanted every cooling tower to be registered in the jurisdiction, and they wanted the model number, they wanted the make, how it's being maintained, every month how you're doing the testing. We want the samples, the results of the lab tests. They wanted to be reported on a regular basis, and so very, very stringent, because this was a big deal. And so a lot of states that were starting to follow that. Some of them have already enacted that as well. CDC, they have guidelines. They have nice descriptions of what should be done. And one of the later slides will talk about what's going on in the private sector, and how research has grown, and how companies are coming up with the new techniques and faster techniques, if you will, to basically be able to mitigate and find out what's going on. OSHA is extremely important, as you all know, in the construction industry. So they have their own regs that drive that. And then a lot of states, Maryland, California, JACO is the Joint Commission. For those of you who are in the healthcare business, they do a lot of inspections, and every 4 years they want to check that. But they are in the process of changing the requirements as well. Any questions? Quarterly testing is an important aspect of all of these features. So, okay, so we talked about different scenarios, types of buildings, types of systems that will possibly be impacted when Legionella is in the system. So this is sort of a slide that talks about the roles and responsibilities, right? So if I am a building owner, I can't sleep at night because, if such a thing happens. So I'm always looking for an opportunity to make sure that this does not happen. So how do we start it? How do we plan it so that it doesn't happen? The FM, facility management team, and the architect engineer. So this is sort of a very generic slide, and you can apply it with some changes to different scenarios, if you will, right? If you have a brand new building coming up, and you give the project to an AE, you hire an AE and say, okay, well, it's going to schematic design. So right from the beginning, you have to think about, whether the AE is considering these things, right? They want to make sure that, they understand what the water system, typically, start doing the energy analysis, and they say, okay, well, actually dictates such and such system. The moment you have a water system, you have a cooling tower to increase the efficiency of the overall plant, that's a trigger point, right? So the AE should know that, hey, I have to plan for to make sure that we have some mechanisms built into this. So when we develop water system diagrams, right, we're going to be thinking about that, discussing with the owners of the facility, and obviously the open and closed loop, different types of scenarios. The next one, obviously, is the water treatment contractor. So, in a brand new building, you really don't think about water treatment, right away. But during the discussions, design development, or construction documents phase, when you're putting the system together, right, they may have their own, people whom they want to put in to be doing the water treatment. The local water treatment company is, by default, in larger enterprise level systems, we have seen that, let's say, a base, for example, right, Army, Navy, Air Force, and so these people are hired by the facility managers directly sometimes. Sometimes they are part of the water treatment contractor, part of the O&M management team, which is subbed out to, let's say, ABMs of the world, and some of you may be working there. But anyway, so long story short, you have to bring them in and make sure that they are part of the discussions, because they may have certain, preferred ways of doing control, and they may have labs they work with. We'll get into some of the details. So the AE sort of works with that, looks at the systems, wants to make sure that there's water treatment contract involvement, and this way, they have established the control points, in the system where they can draw the water, and they have defined what those limits will be, what's the temperature going to be. We'll look at some of those as on the slide as well. And then how do you monitor it, right? So, and here comes, some sort of data collection, right? You want to do ongoing monitoring. You could do that, right? How many of the facilities have you seen the ongoing water temperature in the domestic hot water? Probably not. So that's important. So they work together and they come up with a game plan. And then last but not the least, in that diagram, the architects, engineers, obviously, plus the water treatment, plus the facility, they all sit together, right? And they discuss, how I'm going to make sure that, this thing doesn't happen. So they prepare documentation, data logs, create Excel sheets, something that they can store in the CMMS, if you will, and really be able to validate all of the results that are continuously coming in. You have 10 different systems. You have every month you're testing for, all of these things and sort of trending all of that stuff. So it becomes an interesting thing in conjunction with, the daily, heating and cooling calls that the FM team is sort of addressing, right? Because they're so busy. So all of that has to be taken into account. Okay, so as a designer, I am worried about, okay, the owner gives me a building and I'm starting to look into the water system. So what are the things I'd be worried about? First thing is code study. Where am I, right? If I'm in New York City, okay, I got to do this X, Y, Z. I got to, when I'm doing a system selection and water treatment design, look at the codes as to what's applicable and what's not, and maybe use the most stringent of the codes or the criteria. Talk to the owner about it. Hey, look, we're going to have to do this. This is going to cost you, $5,000 a month or something, right? Really think about allocating maybe a small space for doing biological testing in the building. Why not? You train them up. You have water treatment contractor, or you have one of your own officials who is doing O&M, possibly looking into that, right? And so we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So water systems, and then also the water temperatures, the control points, looking at the limits and code compliance and all that stuff. So it's an initial phase of design, so we can definitely look at that with the with the complete participation of the management. So construction documents. So when it comes to writing specs, and there's so many specs out there, right? So a lot of us do private work. Some of us do government work, VA work. I was talking to a few folks. They all have their own specifications, and I think some of them are. I was interacting with some people who write the master specs, and I was looking at the specs on water filtration and domestic. Division 22 is all about plumbing. So do we have these things? Do we have the checklist? What do we need to tell the designer? What do we need to tell the contractor, right? So that he or she builds some sort of a mechanism and addresses some of these things. And I was looking at the specs and I was like, wait, where are these? And they said, well, this should be more of an O&M. I'm like, yes, I agree, but how does the building owner know from the get-go? How does the contractor know that he has to plan for this? So a lot of those sections are filtration sections, domestic hot water sections, heat exchanger sections. In case of HVAC, similar when you do a lot of heat exchangers, low temp water systems, going towards condensing boilers, right? Condensing boilers are, pretty, the higher delta T you have, the more efficient the boiler becomes, right? So the temperatures go down. When the temperatures go down, there could be areas where the water is stagnant, low use, no use, change of season. So we got to be thinking about all those things when we write those specs. Locations of equipment. So in hospitals, for example, you have a lot of times where, dialysis patients, where are those, equipment being sited? Where is the cooling tower located? Where is the intake, right? So if you have, let's say air blowing through with a certain wind speed, and you have an air handling unit intake or people working regularly changing filters. Somebody was saying that some of the ABC people, they do some of the stuff, but some don't. They don't want to get into that because if you're testing, you have to be careful about those and being responsible for, getting into solving those problems. Testing, adjusting, and balancing, that's an important part of this whole thing, right? When water systems are, commissioned, you have to, demonstrate all of that and make sure that all the issues related to Legionella are incorporated. Dead legs obviously is an old thing, but it's critically important in the case of Legionella. There we have 50, 60, 70-year-old buildings, and things change. We do addition in part of a building, hospitals or any other laboratory facility, and we try to cap it off. Well, let's make sure that before we cap it off, we are capping it off the right place, and there's always a flow, right? Certain types of fittings should be avoided, and this starts in the design phase. And sometimes, as a designer, I have seen like, okay, yeah, we got to send this out. It has to be out on the street, so let's do this fast. And people forget, hush hush. It's all CAD related, but it could be an issue. O&M, we talked about the specs and some of the ongoing things. We have some slide later on where we talk about the limits. Regular flushing with active water treatment. What does that mean? You have a couple of tanks, and sometimes more than a couple of tanks. Closed loop, open loop. You have a huge water 4-inch line, domestic hot water line coming into the facility, and how do we make sure that the water that's coming in, obviously it should be flowing in at a pretty good speed because it's the whole. And then how do you treat that water initially? How do you filter that water initially to get rid of all the microbes and possible protozoans or even Legionella? So there are systems out there who we should be looking into. And one of the things is, because this is becoming so hot now, if you add these equipment, right, what happens to your pressure drop, right? So energy. So everything is sort of related. And so from an initial design standpoint, and before the drawing goes out for construction, you got to be, thinking a lot about it. Cooling tower makeup water valve. Why is that important? Because there's always water, cold water coming into the facility, and you're sending it to either to the basin directly, or you're feeding into the pipe within the plant, right? It's operation, it's maintained well. It's again, period of non-use. We have to think about that. So a lot of considerations like that. Adequate separation between cooling tower and kitchen exhaust location. This is another thing that happened at one of the sites. I don't have that as a case study, but again, people were working in a lot of the humid areas. People trying to maintain the exhaust fans. And it was entrainment. So the cooling tower at the top of the cooling tower was at a slightly higher location compared to where the exhaust fan was, and they proved it down to the fact that all the water mist was actually going down to the fans. So there's some solid, should not do these things. There's a list out there that enables you to plan your project well. Any questions, folks? Okay, so why did I pick this slide, right? This is just a slide that actually shows the water system, if you will, right? The water system in this case is a domestic, we want to use solar energy, right? So we have some solar panels, right? We have some solar panels here on the top of roof. This got built. It's actually functioning at Fort Stewart in Georgia. It serves this plant, the heating plant itself, supports close to 400,000 square feet hospital, community hospital down there. So I picked this one because I wanted to show just a relative, location of control points possible. By the way, at that time, we were not worried about Legionella when we designed it, right? But in hindsight, obviously, we have gone back to the client and really talked to them about what we should be doing post installation. I mean, it's working fine and whatnot. But so let's talk about the system just a little bit, and so you can easily understand. So this loop, here's an indirect heat exchanger. We have solar panels here, some temperature gauges. So this pipe, you can imagine this pipe to be on the roof, kind of, going from one panel. I think we had about maybe 10 panels, if you will, evacuated tube type of solar panels, right? Heat exchanger, and this is the indirect. We have huge solar storage tank, if you will, because it's a hospital, it needs a lot of storage, right? Almost 25 feet tall. And so this heat exchanger, this is your glycol loop, and this is your domestic hot water. So does some heat exchange here, takes the water, heats up the water in the storage tank. This is another loop, a heat exchanger, and this is your, your domestic hot water in the hospital or whatever, schematically speaking. So, a few heat exchangers. So let's think about this. So you have, you're doing the best, possible design. You're tapping the solar energy, but there could be, colder days, cloudy days, right? And your pumps may not be running, right? So, obviously the temperatures in this loop, cyclone, what I call the new wave, El Nino, whatever that is, right? You can get really bad weather and cold temperatures even during summer. So if this is not functioning, you have stagnant water. So you have to be careful about how we're going to treat this, right? You don't want this stagnant water to stay stagnant. Just going back to the question, how do you make sure? So maybe you have pumps running all the time. Well, if you run the pumps, you're spending energy, right? So how does energy come into play? Some of these things. And in this is part of the mechanical room, same issue, right? this loop here is in the mechanical room, and it's in the storage tank. Obviously, we want to maintain 140 degree all the time, and that you can achieve because let's say if this is not running, right, you have the boilers feeding water to this heat exchanger, probably 150, 160 degrees, that provides heat in this loop and keeps the storage tank at 140 degrees, right? So a bunch of different scenarios, non-use, bad weather, not really conducive to solar heat tapping and using the. So what do we do? Well, obviously we have these. These temperature sensors. They're monitoring the temperatures, right? It's on your DDC. It's in your. You can monitor. You can put trends. You can make sure that these things are not falling behind, right? And so this is continuous commissioning type of continuous monitoring that we see all these, representatives from different companies. Are we doing that, right? If we're doing a whole of HVAC, 20 different air handlers, 5 chillers, 5 towers, primary flow, why not put this in, right? So this has to be all planned and done well. Obviously, it can be done after the fact, right? There's no, it's just only money, but let's do that. Any questions? Just a continuation of continuous monitoring. Again, we bring in the water treatment contractor. Typically, he's going to be the guy responsible for making sure, right, that he's the prevention plan and the initial planning that has been done before, he's sticking to it. The control points that are established, taking samples, observing the temperatures on the DDC screen. The graph on the right shows some sort of a chemical water treatment dashboard, if you will. And so the objective, this is a part of the regular system HVAC water treatment, but all the domestic water and all that treatment on the cooling tower, everything is incorporated. So you're observing the levels of chlorine in the system. You're monitoring that, you're putting into the DDC, right? So it can be easily trended and seen. So control points are being inspected, software for chemical additions and all that stuff. So all those are being monitored. And so the last aspect here, artificial intelligence. So as we collect, as we evolve, right? In the plenary session, the gentleman from that fiber optic company, he was talking about data, right? So why, we're collecting so much data, it's becoming faster, and we have the storage capability. So we're collecting all this data. Why not we sort of do this on a yearly basis? So after a year or two, we have observed the temperatures and we have seen how many, and depending on the region of the country or the world, you can correlate this to the weather conditions, right? So when it's really cloudy out there, right, your water temperatures are trending like that. So you should be worried about that. Then you can send notifications. So based on the past, data that was collected, you can plan for future. And a lot of these things are coming into play. A lot of software companies are trying to, put that into their algorithms to be able to monitor it and make sure things don't happen, bad things don't happen. Just a little bit more. So when you are worried about the temperature and stagnation, right? What are the types of systems the hot water storage tanks, the domestic hot water heaters, all the temperatures in different loops, sinks, showers, kitchen equipment, dialysis equipment, solar water heating system. They all need to be monitored for those two big things. What's the temperature, whether we have stagnation, and make sure that there is recirculation pumps, right, to be able to circulate the water. Then disinfectants, the higher the temperature, you need at least 140 degrees to be able to, do that for domestic hot water. in the case of decorative fountains and cooling towers, you have the biocides in the cooling towers. That's so important. And how are we monitoring that? What are the levels that need to be maintained, right? And obviously the temperature-only cooling towers, ice makers, hot tubs, that should be avoided. Now we're doing water service entrance. So we have in an O&M slide, we were going to talk about some of the companies that have these water filtration systems that sort of screen all of the bad stuff. But that's not a guarantee that there will be no Legionella. The only way you can make sure that there's no Legionella is by the temperatures reaching a certain 150 degrees, possibly 100 to 140 to 150. So you should be able to rapidly heat the water up to those conditions. One of the things here is bioreactors, right? So net zero water systems, there are mandates out in California that every facility should have some sort of gray water system. So in larger commercial facilities, right, they want to put in some sort of recycling and treatment of the water, the waste that's coming out of the sanitary systems, and create that using bioreactors. So the temperature on those loops fall down to maybe 70 degrees, 80 degrees, right? So you should be careful about that. And so the more complicated the system and it's inside your building, you have to be very, very careful about your velocities in the pipes, your temperatures, and monitoring. And so I'm just sharing these things because we're coming across all of these issues in different scenarios as we try to make the net zero goal of that we want to achieve, right? Any questions?
Can you explain how this Legionella is an ice maker?
Right. So in ice makers, what's happening is they have the water comes in, right? You have sometimes the temperatures fall down. Well, they fall down, but in certain cases, when the ice maker is not functional, right? The water becomes stagnant, and with passage of time, it could sort of become a period of non-use. It could reach those temperatures and stagnate, if you will. So it could lead to some sort of longer periods of non-use and create that. And also because of the fact that it's rejecting heat, right? It's a condensing system. So the heat locally affects the temperature of the water, and especially if there's no insulation, people forget insulation on those pipes. So it causes some of those things. So that's one of the reasons why you have to be extremely careful in how you design those things and where you locate them. And periodic maintenance and making sure that insulation is present everywhere and the temperatures are maintained to the design conditions. Okay, so O&M practices, the O&M team is extremely important. In this case, obviously, high capacity filtration systems are being used all the time. And like there's a water control company, the name of the company is Water Control, and they have manufactured and installing all over the place at point of use systems. Right at the point of use, you can put these, and they can screen all of the bacteria and viruses. They stick to that. They claim that it's 99.99% efficient, although that you can't guarantee, right? Building entrance, they have equipment for that. It's a bunch of filters and control points. You have points where it can come as a skid package as well, so that's another way that people are doing this. Corrective and obviously testing, right? So let's talk about testing. So the research lately has been a lot of companies want to sort of look at what the CDC templates are for testing, microbiological testing, right? So all of the non-plate testing, microbiological testing, taking the samples was recommended by CDC. So there are companies out there, and there's a product, called Legionella. You may have heard of them. And a lot of water treatment contractors are starting to use that. They did a lot of research and published and found that it was more effective than the CDC method. But essentially, it's a kit, right? It's a kit that you can buy for like $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 with a bunch of agents and whatnot. So you take a sample and then you test it, for like 7 days. Within 7 days, you can get the results, right? And make sure that you are free of Legionella. Now, so from a planning standpoint, as I was saying earlier, if you have a lab, they can train you, they can train an O&M person in your building to be able to do that. And obviously, there's chemicals and those, testing plates needed on a regular basis. That's some cost. But if you set it up in a right way, you're able to, have a great in-house capability. Now, what they would do is they also have labs who are sort of in the network, who are more licensed. And so let's say if you have your own team doing this, they can act as a third party. So you're using the test kit, and you can send it out occasionally to make sure that what you're doing is on track with everything else that's going on. Because ultimately, you have to send these results to, let's say if you're in New York, you have to send it to the authorities. And because it could become an issue, if something went wrong and people still got this, right? What if they get it? And you have to protect yourself as well, right? So it's sort of a catch-22 game. You're doing it yourself, you're saving money, but at the same time, you're making sure that there's somebody else also looking into it. So if I were the owner, I'd probably think about a system like that. So corrective actions, extremely important. And then some of the things that the water treatment contractors love to do, obviously cleaning, inspection, just the regular cleaning of water systems, cooling towers, visual inspection, checking to make sure there's no growth, algae growth, or, in the hot, or actually the cold basins of cooling towers, or even some of the features that you may have in the facility. And it's not that expensive. You just get to make the people aware of that. You train your staff, and he can be a part of the HVAC team, who's replacing filters and going around, cartridge filters, water systems. Again, disinfection, hypochlorination, and temperature increase are the two best ways to do it. And depending on what systems you're looking at, obviously you can follow the instructions from some of these manufacturers and follow them to establish the actual chlorine levels. So that's a monthly disinfection program, but you can make it more often if you'd like, and so just to be on the safe side, maybe make it 3 weeks, right? So how does it hurt? It's not much of additional cost, but you have this, some peace of mind, if you will, right? So that nothing happens. Legionella treatment is less than 100 colony forming units per milliliter of the sample. And obviously, so the thing about this is not this is unregulated market, and you have to maintain these at established levels. Lab culture, which we talked about, is extremely important. Every other month, just keep doing it, and this way you can, if something happens, you can always go back to the results. So cooling towers, just some sort of a protocol. The federal guide specs talk about maintaining pH of 7.5 to 8.5, right? Just to make sure that it's not too acidic or too basic solution. Legionella testing every 6 months is a minimum. So by maintaining the right biocide content and feeding them and making sure those equipment that feed the biocides are being maintained and they have the right levels. We have seen things like large facility, a 1 million square feet facility, and the water treatment contractor is on call, right? He's not part of the regular O&M team. So the way they work is, that's part of cooling tower, blow down, whatever. When he gets the alerts, he tells the O&M guy, go ahead and do this, and they will locally train him to avoid cost. But O&M guy is always running around doing 100 other things, right? So some of the chemical treatment aspects get ignored and doesn't have time to address them on a regular basis. So that goes back to the importance of planning it ahead of time and a regular checklist and each control point and whatnot. So that's the biocide, extremely important aspect of this whole plan. Yeah.
So on the cooling tower treatment, you say shut off the fans. You don't say shut off the pumps necessarily. It seems like the biocide film, the biofilm would actually occur in the pipe system as well, and would reinfect the water if you didn't, circulate the entire system, including the field, where it looks like the biofilm would reside as well. Should they circulate the whole condenser water loop at that residual for that period of time?
Yeah, so that's a great thought there. Shutting off the fan essentially is de-energizing the tower, if you will, on the air side, just to make sure that it's not functional and it's not really, so you're doing the water side only, obviously. And, because if you don't know, let's say there's Legionella, they found Legionella, and how do you, go about fixing the problem? So basically, I would shut off all the towers, first of all, right? I would evacuate the building, especially the plant, because that's a big deal. And this is just a protocol to make sure that you have the right chlorine levels, you upping the chlorination level of the water, and then obviously adding all of those dispersants to be able to do that. And then, totally. I mean, it could, the water is going back to the plant, right, where the chillers are, right? So somehow isolate that piece as well. And this is a very generic, action plan, but it can be modified and should be looked into to make sure that there's no sort of, you're restricting your operation to like as smaller portion of the pipe or the loop as possible. Does that answer the question or no?
Well, yeah, a lot of the cases that I've read about, the Ford plant in Cleveland and others, were cooling tower sourced, and it's always been curious to me, how do they know that they clean that? And just reading through that protocol, I didn't see circulate the water as a part of that. Drain it, refill it, etc. But cleaning looks like to me that would include the entire interior webbed surface.
I would drain the whole thing, and you're right. There's absolutely, you have to. I think the pumping aspect of this is inbuilt into the, the whole loop, the draining. So by default, you are pushing the water to make sure that it's not, you're taking, you're flushing the entire system correctly. So, and we can chat more about that as well. Have some documents.
Another quick question.
Sure.
The hospital samples that I've seen taken in our area did in fact have not greater than 100 CFUs, but still were there, and that worried people because it was there. So the treatment and it was at the faucets,
Mm-hmm.
on the outlet of the faucet,
Right.
not somewhere that can be recirculated and treated or whatever. So how do they treat the faucets themselves as sources of that growth? In the same sense that you would clean a cooling tower.
Yeah, absolutely. So So first of all, you got to shut off the building. I mean, you got evacuate the building, and I've heard of horror stories. Fort Sam Houston is a classic example. And once you evacuate the building, then you got to be in your top gear. You got to have a game plan, and you got to have the piping systems laid out. You know exactly where to put it. So again, going back to design, isolation valves, right? So huge building, I got to be able to cordon off a certain area. Let's shut it off. Let's open the valves. Let's run hot water. I don't know how you inject. Do you do that at the central plant? 2 floors down, 3 floors down, 500 feet away, or you have points where you can really bring in temporary pumps, if you will, like do a closed loop and generate hot water somewhere else, bring it, and then sort of flush the whole system, because that's the only way you're going to get it, right? Chlorinated, high temp, as much as possible. So these are sort of on-the-spot decisions that you have to make in a very fast manner at the site, obviously with input from water treatment contractors and whatnot. So,
so the initial contamination with Legionella comes from the water supply.
Well,
where does it come from?
So Legionella lives in water systems everywhere, right? So when the water temperatures go up in the range of 70 to 120, that's when they start multiplying, right? And they grow exponentially, right? For if that's an extended period of time. So some of the treatment systems here, that the previous slide we talked about the the equipment and the filtration. So you try to filter that as much as possible if there is in the system, and then you're able to increase the temperatures in the domestic hot water loop, and be able to control it that way. Now, because the faucet's not being used, right? The water is there, right? The water is there close to the faucet, and and the temperature is right in that range, right? So they start growing because it's stagnant or whatever that is, right? Even if it's being used partially, it can grow to a level, so it's one of those things that we can do our best to be able to control it. And that's why you cannot eradicate it, right? You can't, it's like you walk out, you get, bacteria. Bacteria is in the air, right? You breathe in, your immune system, tries to counteract it, and then you're fine. You take medication, then you're fine. So similar to that, it's hopefully I'm answering your question. So shutting off fans, we talked about that. Shock treatment. This is one of the protocols used by the state of Wisconsin. Grading system, and then doing mechanical cleaning, if you will, refilling, flushing. So repeated operations. You have to sort of keep doing it. Resampling, testing, and then again mechanical cleaning. So this is just a general flow chart that you can adapt for your condition, whatever your system looks like, and how you do it. Get engineers involved, going in team right away in action, right? You have to have them as a backup and call them up. Sorry. Okay, so didn't want to conclude, but I guess we're running out of time probably. It's a notifiable disease, and you have to report it to. You can report it to CDC if something happens. It's a big deal. A lot of lawyers are making lots of money because of this, and they're helping people, sue, the owners of the building because of this. And you'll be surprised how big this is. Early detection is extremely important, and there are ways to detect it, via systems design and operation and maintenance on a regular basis. Regular basis is the key. And then, with the data technologies that we have these days, the faster, data processing, and but obviously human involvement is essential. Laboratory testing of samples is extremely important. And then, the teamwork, right? You have to talk about it with the team. Owners have the right people. They know how to, jump in if something happens, right? And then maintain and verification and testing, making sure that tests are being done correctly, and validation is going on at the same time. So it's a process, it's just like you're commissioning, in a building. So, that's extremely important. Some of the references, I put some of them in here. There are all the other, journal articles that I went through, spent some time, and they're also available. You will be amazed as how much research is going on, and a lot of these hospital systems, they swing into action and start to do the testing and analysis and whatnot. So, okay. Any questions, folks? Pretty straightforward topic, right? There's a lot of information on the web as well, but if you like to get any more information, we'll be tracking how the regulations change as a function of time. And I'm sure, there'll be updates and a review of past cases and whatnot. So, this is an ongoing thing. All right, so with that, thank you for coming, and I appreciate your time. Have a great trip back. Thanks.